The rain came down like it meant to erase everything. Ryder Voss hadn't slept in 31 hours. He wasn't running toward anything. He hadn't been doing that in years. The highway through the Montana high country was black and empty and the kind of cold that got into your teeth, and he rode through it because stopping was worse. Stopping meant the silence, and the silence meant Emma. Then, beneath the old Calvert steel bridge, where the river had swallowed 3 cars in the last flood and nobody bothered to post signs anymore, he heard it. Not wind, not the creek. A child. And the men hunting her were already close enough that he could see their headlights moving through the pines. If this story already has its hooks in you, you're not alone. Subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what comes next, because these stories only get darker, deeper, and more dangerous from here. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city, what country you're watching from tonight. I want to see exactly how far this road reaches. Now, let's ride. The bridge had no business being there anymore. The county had condemned it in 2019 and strung a single rusted chain across the access road with a sign that said "No entry." Structural hazard, and everyone in Calvert County had obeyed that sign because everyone in Calvert County had sense enough not to trust old iron over fast water in November. Ryder Voss had never had that kind of sense. He ducked the chain on instinct, some buried reflex that said the noise from the main road was wrong. Too coordinated, too slow, engines idling in a pattern that didn't belong to anyone lost. He killed the Harley's engine 30 yards short of the bridge and sat in the sudden silence for a moment, rain hammering his cut, his shoulders, the scarred bridge of his nose. The exhaust ticked beneath him like a clock running down. He pulled off his helmet and hung it on the handlebars and just listened, the way a man listens who spent 3 tours learning that the sounds a place refuses to make are more important than the ones it does. The river below was high and ugly and fast from 2 weeks of rain. He heard it between one gust and the next, small, broken, trying very hard not to be heard at all. He was off the bike and down the embankment before he'd made any conscious decision to move, his boots finding purchase in mud that wanted to swallow them whole, one hand on a root, one hand trailing the damp concrete of the bridge abutment. And there she was, wedged into the narrow shelf of mud and gravel beneath the bridge's eastern footing, maybe 3 feet above the waterline, half her body in shadow and the other half lit by whatever pale nothing passed for moonlight through 4 inches of cloud cover. 10 years old. Maybe. Small for it. Dark hair plastered against her face in ropes, wearing what had once been a white dress with small yellow flowers that was now the color of the riverbank. 1 foot bare, 1 foot wrong, bent at the ankle in a direction ankles don't bend. And she was pressing both hands over her own mouth, physically holding the sounds inside herself, eyes so wide and so dark they looked like holes punched through to somewhere else. She saw him and made a sound like a wire pulled too tight. "Hey." His voice came out lower than he intended, rough from disuse and cigarettes and 3 days of not talking to anyone. "Hey, I'm not one of them." She didn't believe him. He could see that plainly, and he didn't blame her for it. He crouched down, making himself smaller, and put both hands out where she could see them. The rain ran down his forearms and dripped off his knuckles, and he stayed exactly like that, not pushing forward, not reaching, just existing at her level and letting her look at him. His cut said Iron Revenants across the back in cracked white lettering above a skull, with a compass rose behind it. His face said a man who had taken some serious hits and absorbed them all, and maybe not come out the other side entirely whole. "Broken ankle," he said. Not a question. She nodded, the tiniest motion. "You can't walk out of here." Another nod. "I've got a motorcycle up on the road. There are men—" He paused, recalibrated. "The people looking for you. They're up on Route 9. If I carry you up the east side of the bank, we'll be behind the bridge support. They won't see us from the road. But I need you to trust me for about 90 seconds. Can you do 90 seconds? She was shaking. The whole thin length of her was vibrating with cold and pain and fear, and she looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that were doing a lot of complicated math, and then she said very quietly, "Your hands are bleeding." He looked down. She was right. He'd cut himself on something coming down the bank, a line across his right palm that was running thin and pink in the rain. "Yeah," he said. "That happens sometimes." Something shifted in her face. Not trust, exactly. More like a provisional suspension of the alternative. He pulled off his cut, the heavy leather vest with all its patches and its decades of road dust worked into the grain, and wrapped it around her as best he could. And when he lifted her, she made one involuntary sound of pain and then bit down on it and went silent, her arms around his neck, her face pressed against his jaw. She weighed almost nothing. That hit him somewhere he hadn't been prepared to be hit. The East Bank was brutal. He went up on his knees twice, once losing his footing completely and slamming his shoulder into the abutment, catching them both against the concrete with a grunt that he made sure was quiet, made sure didn't become anything larger. She didn't make a sound. She held on. At the top, in the shadow of an old willow whose roots had buckled half the chain-link fence, he settled her against the bike and started the engine low and kept the headlight off. The SUVs on Route 9 were 200 yards east, sitting crosswise on the road with their high beams cutting the rain, and there were men walking the ditch line with flashlights. Serious, organized, methodical. Not searchers. Hunters know the difference. You can see it in how they hold the light. He went south on the dirt access road and came out onto County Road 7, 3 miles below the bridge, and only then brought the headlight up and opened the throttle and let the engine breathe. She sat in front of him with his cut buttoned across both of them as best it could manage, her back against his chest, and he felt her shaking for a long time before it slowly, incrementally, stopped. He didn't ask questions. Not yet. You don't ask questions to someone who's been in the mud under a bridge. You get them somewhere warm and dry and let the fear come down to a level where words are possible. The Latimer Motel was 9 miles south on Route 7, a single-story strip of 12 rooms with a vacancy sign that buzzed and flickered and had been doing so since the previous owner died in 2021. The current owner was a heavy-set man named Pruitt who watched too much cable news and minded his own business with an almost spiritual commitment. Ryder had stayed here before. Pruitt didn't ask for ID, Ryder paid in cash, always had, and Pruitt's only comment on the girl was to look at the ankle and say, "There's an ice pack in the machine by the office. Machine's broken, ice pack's on top of it, take it." Then he went back to his television. Room 7 had a heater that worked if you hit it on the left side. 2 beds with covers that smelled like industrial laundry, and something underneath that was probably just age, and a bathroom with a light that hummed. Ryder got the heater running and found a thin blanket from the closet shelf and got her onto the bed nearest the wall. Back to the wall, he understood that instinct, and elevated the ankle on a folded pillow and set the ice pack and sat down in the chair by the window and just let the room be quiet for a minute. She watched him from the bed with the covers pulled to her chin. "I'm Ryder." She looked at him. "You don't have to tell me your name." "Nyla," she said. And then, like she was correcting herself on something, "Nyla Reed." "Okay, Nyla Reed." He pulled out what was left of a gas station coffee from his jacket pocket, still faintly warm, and set it on the nightstand within her reach. "Okay." She didn't touch the coffee. She looked at it for a while, and then at him. "You're not going to call anyone?" "Who would you want me to call?" Her jaw tightened. She looked away toward the wall. That was an answer. He'd seen law enforcement do a lot of things over the years. He'd seen them do some good ones and some very bad ones. And the look on this child's face when he asked the question told him everything about which category she'd experienced. He made a note of that and filed it somewhere cold and useful. He went to the bathroom and cleaned his hand, working the gash on his palm under cold water until the bleeding slowed, then wrapping it in a strip of the hand towel that he cut with his boot knife. His reflection in the bathroom mirror looked like a man who had been through several things in sequence and not stopped between them, which was accurate. 44 years old. 6'2" and carrying it badly tonight. Gray coming in hard at the temples, scar through the left eyebrow from a bar in Billings he didn't think about anymore. Eyes the color of old asphalt. That's what his wife had said once, standing in a kitchen that no longer existed, in a life that no longer existed, before Emma. He didn't think the name deliberately. It came up through the floor of him the way water comes through cracked concrete. Emma, 6 years old, yellow dress, different pattern than Nyla's, little ducks instead of flowers, but the same instinct of yellow, and he put both hands on the sink and breathed through his nose for a count of 10, then went back out. Nyla was still awake. She'd pulled the covers tighter. "How long were you under that bridge?" She thought about it. "Since before dark." 5, 6 hours in freezing mud with a broken ankle. He kept his face neutral with an effort. "The men who were looking for you," he said. "How many?" "At least 6, maybe more." She paused. "There were 2 cars when they took us from the van. Then more came." He caught the word. "Us." "How many kids were in that van, Nyla?" She looked at the wall again. Her throat worked. 8, she said. "There were 8 of us." The room did something then. Contracted somehow, went tighter and colder, even with the heater running. Ryder sat with that number for a moment. 8 children in a van, and 7 of them were somewhere else tonight, and this one was under a bridge with a broken ankle. "Where were they taking you?" "I don't know the name of it." Her voice was very careful and very flat, the way a voice gets when it's been trained down to the necessary minimum by sustained fear. "A building. I've been there before. There are others there. Not just kids. Adults who watch." She stopped. He didn't push it. He could see the shape of what she wasn't saying, and he didn't need her to put words to it tonight. "Okay," he said. "Okay, Nyla. You don't have to say anything else right now." He turned to the window and pulled the curtain back a 1/4 inch and looked at the motel lot. Empty. Route 7 beyond it empty. The rain was easing slightly, dropping from a downpour to a hard, steady soak, and the neon sign of the motel threw a wash of broken red and orange light across the wet asphalt that pulsed when the sign flickered. His phone had 3 bars. He looked at it for a long time. There were people he could call. There was a process for this. The rational, legal, institutional process. The one that involved phone trees and official channels, and people in offices who would start filling out forms and making notifications, and in doing so would put Nyla's location on a system that could be accessed by anyone with the right clearance, or the right money, or both. The men in those SUVs had been coordinated and equipped and utterly unhurried in their search pattern. That kind of operation didn't run without infrastructure. Infrastructure meant connections. Connections meant the rational, legal, institutional process was a door he wasn't ready to open. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. He needed to think. He needed coffee that wasn't gas station coffee, and he needed someone who understood how deep bad could go in a county that looked like nothing was wrong. He was still staring at the window when headlights swept across it from the lot side. His hand went to the Colt on his hip before the lights resolved into a single bike. No headlight bar, just the low running lights of a Road King that he knew by the sound before he saw the machine. He knew the pipes, knew the way the engine hung just a half beat before it died. He was at the door before the knock came, and when he opened it, the man on the other side was soaked to the bone and wearing a cut that said Iron Revenants on the back, same as his own, except this one had a road captain's patch that had been torn off and resewn and torn off again, and the man inside it was Ren Cole, who had walked out of the club without a word 14 months ago, and whom Ryder hadn't spoken to since. Ren looked at him, then past him, at the child on the bed. "I've been riding since Missoula," Ren said. His voice was flat as road tar. "Found you by the bike's transponder, which you should have pulled before you parked, Ryder, because I'm not the only one looking, and I'm the only one looking who wants to keep you breathing." He stepped inside without being invited. Ryder led him. "You need to listen to me very carefully," Ren said, pulling the door shut and turning so his back was to Nyla, his voice dropping, "because I've spent 14 months undercover in something you don't have a name for yet, and what you found under that bridge isn't a kidnapping. What you found is a witness. The only living witness who can put names to a network that runs through 4 states and 3 federal jurisdictions and is protected by people with law enforcement credentials." He stopped. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and processed almost none of it. "They will burn this motel to the ground before morning if they figure out where she is." Ryder looked at him for a long moment. "How'd they lose her?" "She jumped from a moving van," Ren said, "broken ankle and all." They both looked at Nyla. She was watching them from the bed with those dark, exhausted eyes, the covers clutched to her chin, the ice pack on her ankle, the untouched coffee on the nightstand. Smart kid, Ryder said quietly. Smart kid, Wren agreed, and then, lower still, almost not audible. She's also the only reason 8 others might still have a chance, but only if she's alive by morning. Outside, on Route 7, a vehicle slowed. Then another. Ryder went to the window and pulled the curtain back 1 inch, and what he saw put ice in his chest that had nothing to do with the November rain, because the 2 black SUVs that had pulled into the far end of the Latimer motel lot were the same ones he'd seen on Route 9, and the men getting out of them were not moving like men who were guessing. They were moving like men who already knew. Ryder let the curtain fall and turned to Wren and said one word. Back. Wren was already moving. He'd been in enough rooms when things went sideways to know what that single syllable meant. It meant the front door was no longer a door. It was a problem, and everything that mattered needed to be behind them and moving. He went to Nyla first, not Ryder, which told Ryder something about the 14 months Wren had spent doing whatever Wren had been doing. Because a man who goes to the child first in a crisis is a man who has been around too many children in crisis. Can you move? Wren asked her quietly. I've been moving all night, she said. There was no time to feel anything about that. Ryder pulled his Colt and went to the bathroom window, frosted glass, small, hinged at the top, and popped it with his elbow and got his head out into the rain and looked. The back of the motel faced a drainage easement, 10 feet of gravel and scrub, then a stand of cottonwood trees that ran south toward a grain storage facility he'd clocked when he'd pulled in. Dark. No movement. The men in the lot were still organizing, which meant they'd sent someone around back in about 45 seconds or they were idiots, and nobody who ran an operation like this was an idiot. 30 seconds, he said. Window. Both of you. Wren got Nyla onto his back without ceremony, her arms around his neck, her broken ankle held clear. She made no sound. Ryder went through the window first, dropping into the gravel, and caught Wren as he came through sideways, and then they moved, not running, because running in gravel sounds like running in gravel, walking fast, measured, along the back wall toward the cottonwoods. And Ryder counted his own heartbeats because that was the only clock that mattered right now. They reached the trees as the first flashlight beam came around the southeast corner of the building. Ryder went flat behind a cottonwood that was barely wide enough to matter and put his hand back and found Wren's arm and pressed twice, "Stop! Stay!" and watched the flashlight move along the back wall, check the bathroom window, pause at the open latch, and then the man holding it said something into a radio that Ryder couldn't hear clearly except for the last word, which was confirmed. He'd left the window open. Elementary mistake. He filed that under the list of things he could not change and moved on. The trees run south, he breathed into Wren's ear. Storage facility. There a vehicle? Road King's in the lot. Forget the Road King. That's a $30,000 motorcycle, Ryder. Forget the Road King. Wren made a sound that was not quite a word and followed him south through the cottonwoods. The grain storage facility was padlocked and dark and had a gravel apron around it wide enough to feel exposed crossing it, but there was a rusted Ford F250 parked against the south wall that had been there long enough for weeds to grow up through the wheel wells, which meant it belonged to the facility and nobody was coming for it tonight. Ryder tried the driver's door. Locked. He took his boot knife and had the lock punched in 20 seconds. Old truck, old lock. And sat in the cold cab and found the wiring under the dash by feel while Wren settled Nyla into the back seat and shut the door with the particular careful quietness of someone who understood that sound traveled on cold air. The engine turned over on the third try. Old diesel rattle, loud enough to make Ryder's jaw tighten, and he reversed without lights across the gravel and found the service road that ran behind the storage facility and went south, and only when they'd put half a mile between themselves and the motel did he bring the headlights up. Nyla was silent in the back. Wren rode shotgun and watched the mirrors. Talk, Ryder said. Where do you want me to start? Start with why you left. Wren's reflection in the passenger window was unreadable. Outside, the rain was tapering again, going thin and directionless, and the truck's wipers dragged across the glass on a worn blade that skipped and stuttered. I left because someone in the club was already in contact with these people, Wren said. I didn't know who. I needed to not know who, officially, while I found out. If I'd stayed, whoever it was would have seen me looking. Ryder's hands tightened on the wheel. You could have told me. No, I couldn't have. I'm the president. Which makes you the first person they'd watch for a reaction. Ren turned his head and looked at him directly for the first time since the motel room. Think about it, Ryder. If I'd come to you and said I think someone in the Revenants is running information to a trafficking network, what happens next? You start watching faces, watching who twitches, and whoever it is they see you watching, and the whole thing goes to ground and we never find it. I needed you to not know. The truck hummed along a dark county road flanked by bare fields and occasional farmhouse lights. And now, Ryder said, now it's too late for quiet. Ren looked back at Nyla. She'd pulled her knees up, the good leg holding the broken one slightly off the seat, and was watching them with the exhausted, measuring attention of a child who had learned to interpret adult conversations through the subtext rather than the words, because the words were usually lies. She changed the equation. Who is it? Ryder said. In the club. Ren was quiet long enough that the non-answer became its own answer of a kind. He either knew and wasn't ready to say, or he suspected and wasn't certain, and both of those were worse than not knowing. Let me get more sure before I put a name on it, Ren said finally. I've been wrong before. That's not an answer. No, Ren agreed. It's not. They drove. The heater in the old truck worked intermittently, cycling on and off, and every time it cycled off, Ryder could feel the cold edge back in through the door seals. He drove southeast, no particular destination yet, just putting distance and road between them and the Latimer, thinking through geography, thinking through options, thinking through the short list of people he trusted, and the long list of reasons why that list had gotten short. These people, he said after a while. The network. What are we talking about? Ren looked at the windshield. Big. How big? I spent 14 months getting close enough to see one layer of it. One layer. And what I saw had judges, had a state senator's chief of staff, had 3 law enforcement personnel I can name and probably more I can't. The operation is compartmentalized. Nobody knows the whole structure. Nobody can give you the whole thing. It runs through a logistics company out of Billings called Crestline Transport. Legitimate business on the surface, bonded carrier, DOT compliant. They move agricultural equipment. What they also move... He stopped. I know what they also move, Ryder said. Ren nodded. The children move through the agricultural routes. Inspections are fixed. When they get where they're going, there are buyers. Not individual buyers. Institutional ones. Arrangements. People who pay for access over time. His voice had gone very flat and controlled, the way voices go when the content is intolerable and the only way to convey it usefully is to strip all the affect out. Nyla wasn't taken for resale. She was taken because she saw something at a previous location that she shouldn't have seen. She's a witness problem, not a cargo problem. That's why they want her dead specifically, not just recovered. From the back seat, very quietly. The man in the room had a badge. Ryder and Ren both went still. What room, Nyla? Ren said, turning. The first place, before the van. She was looking at her own hands in her lap. He came in, and he had a badge on his belt, and he was talking to the man who was in charge. And I heard him say a name I wasn't supposed to hear. And then he looked over and he saw me in the doorway, and he said to the other man, that one has to go. And the other man said, the child? And the first man said yes. Silence in the truck cab, except the engine and the road. What was the name? Ren said carefully. Neela looked at him. Her dark eyes were steady in the way that eyes get steady after they've done all their terrified moving and arrived at something more like resolution. Harlan Veck, she said. He said the name Harlan Veck. Ren sat back and put his hand over his mouth and stared at the ceiling of the truck. You know that name, Ryder said. Harlan Veck is the special agent in charge of the FBI field office in Helena. Ren took his hand down. He is the man who is technically responsible for investigating exactly this kind of operation in this state. The road came out of the fields and crossed a small bridge over a frozen creek, and the headlights of the truck threw yellow light on ice and bare branch, and nothing else for as far as they reached. And Ryder drove through all of it and thought about what it meant to be this far into something with no map and no chain of command, and a 10-year-old girl in the back seat who had just put a federal agent's name inside a trafficking network and turned every official channel they might have used into a loaded gun pointed at her head. He thought about calling Mace. Mace Doherty was his sergeant-at-arms, a man he'd ridden with for 11 years, a man who had carried him out of a bar in Spokane after a night that could have ended very differently, a man who had stood at Emma's graveside and said nothing, which was exactly right, which was the only thing that could have been said. Mace was solid. Mace was the first person he'd call. He thought about what Wren had said, someone in the club. He drove. 20 minutes southeast, there was a place called Donet's, a truck stop that had been operating since the 1970s under 3 different owners and 0 different personalities, all of them characterized by hot food at any hour and the philosophical conviction that what happened in Donet's stayed in Donet's. The current owner was a woman named Berta who weighed maybe 120 and had once removed a man from her premises by his collar with one hand and his belt with the other and deposited him in the parking lot without apparent effort. She knew Ryder. She knew most of the Iron Revenants, the way people in rural Montana got to know their regulars. Not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of practical acknowledgement that these were the men who, when something went wrong at 3 a.m. on a stretch of highway that the sheriff's department took 40 minutes to reach, were already there. He pulled the truck around back, off the lot, where a cluster of semi-trailers provided cover. "Stay here," he told Wren. Then to Nyla, "I'm going to get food and something for your ankle. I'll be inside that door." He pointed to the service entrance on the south side of the building. "You can see it from here. If anyone who isn't me comes near this truck, you get down on the floor. You understand?" She looked at him. "You're going to make phone calls?" "Yes." "To your club?" "Yes." "How do you know you can trust them?" He didn't have a clean answer for that. "I don't know all of them the way I need to right now," he said honestly. "But I know some of them. I know them like I know my own hands." She looked at his hands, the wrapped cut on his right palm, the knuckles. "Okay," she said. Inside, Dunnet smelled like coffee and fryer grease, and the particular institutional warmth of a building that never fully cools down. 2 truckers at the counter, one in a booth near the window, all of them paying attention to their food and their phones. Berta was behind the counter, and she looked at Ryder when he came in and noted the wet cut and the expression and the absence of the usual social preamble, and went to the far end of the counter and poured 2 coffees without being asked. He sat on a stool at the end and called Mace. 3 rings. Mace picked up sounding fully awake, which meant he hadn't been asleep. "Where are you?" Mace said. No greeting. "Southeast of Calvert. I need ears, not a meeting. You alone?" A brief pause that Ryder measured carefully. "Bathroom," Mace said. "Dex is in the front room. Dexter Pruitt, newer patch. 2 years with the club." Ryder ran him through his memory quickly. Quiet man, ex-Army, good mechanic, showed up when needed. Nothing alarming, nothing particularly confirming either. "I've got a situation," Ryder said. "Significant. I heard your bike didn't come home tonight." "Who told you that?" "Gotta ask?" The Revenant's clubhouse had eyes on its lot the way any club did. Somebody always up, somebody always watching. The fact that his Road King hadn't come back would have been noted within an hour. "I need 3 people," Ryder said. "You, Teller, and Braid. No one else. I need them in separate vehicles. No club markings. Meeting point," he thought. "Grain elevator on Route 12, the old Harkin facility. You know it?" "Yeah." "Sunrise." "That's 4 hours." "I'm aware of that, Mace." Another pause, longer this time. "Ryder, what did you get into tonight?" "Something that was already there waiting to be gotten into," he said. "Sunrise, Harkin elevator. Tell them pack weight and plan to ride dirty for a while." He hung up and looked at the phone and thought about the pause. It was a normal pause. A man woken in the middle of something being asked to mobilize in 4 hours. That warranted a pause. He told himself that and filed the uncertainty in the same place he'd filed the open motel window and kept moving. He ordered food, eggs, toast, 2 soups for the truck, and an ace bandage from the first aid kit Berta kept under the counter, because Berta kept a first aid kit under the counter, the way useful people always prepared for what was coming. He paid cash and went back out through the service door. Wren had moved to the driver's seat. His eyes were on the lot entrance when Ryder came around the trailers, and they tracked him all the way to the passenger door with the specific vigilance of a man who had spent 14 months not being sure who was going to come through a door. "Clear?" Ryder said. One car slowed on the road, kept going. Ryder handed the suit back to Nyla, who took it and held it in both hands for the warmth before she opened it, which told him something about how cold she'd gotten that she prioritized the heat over the hunger. He watched her drink the first few sips, and something moved in him that he pushed back down because this was not the time, and there was no version of this where feeling things helped anyone. He wrapped her ankle with the ace bandage, working by the light of his phone. She sat very still and watched his face while he worked, rather than watching his hands. And he got the feeling she was trying to read something in him that she'd been trying to read since the bridge. Some determination of category, some final assessment of which kind of adult he was in the taxonomy of adults she'd compiled from experience. He kept his hands steady and his face neutral, and when he was done, he looked up and met her eyes. "Better?" he said. "Yes," she said, and then, "Thank you." 2 words, small and direct, and carrying the weight of someone who'd learned not to say them carelessly. He nodded and got back in the passenger seat. They sat in the lot behind the trailers and ate, and the rain stopped entirely sometime around 3 in the morning and left a stillness behind it that felt almost threatening, the way stillness does when you've been listening through noise for a long time and the noise suddenly drops away. Ryder drank the second coffee and watched the road and thought. Wren slept for an hour in the driver's seat, which said something about the kind of operational discipline the man had developed. The ability to sleep in any gap, because you never know when the next gap comes. Ryder didn't sleep. Nyla slept in the back, her head against the door, and he listened to her breathe and watched the road and turned the name Harlan Veck over in his mind like a stone he was looking under. At 4:30, he woke Wren and they drove to Harkin. The old grain elevator sat off a county road that hadn't been repaved in 15 years, a cluster of corrugated steel cylinders 60 feet high that loomed against the pre-dawn dark, like something from an older world. The access road was dirt and the gate was padlocked, but the padlock was a combination type, and the combination was 0000, which was the universal combination of padlocks that existed for the appearance of security rather than the practice of it. Ryder drove in and left the gate as he'd found it and parked inside the largest building, behind the elevator machinery, where the truck was invisible from the access road. They waited. Mace came first, on a plain black softail with no patches, at 5:07. Ryder met him at the gate in the gray pre-dawn, and they stood looking at each other in the cold. Mace Doherty was 51 years old and built like a railway tie, and had the face of a man who had made serious decisions and stood by them even when they cost him. He had a beard going gray at the chin and eyes that were very pale blue and very direct, and he looked at Ryder now with the specific quality of attention a man gives to someone he is assessing for damage. "You're bleeding through that wrap," Mace said. "I know." "The kid in the truck?" "Yes." "Ren Cole?" "Yes." Mace absorbed this without visible surprise. Then, "Talk." Ryder talked. He kept it tight and factual. The bridge, the motel, the SUVs, Ren's 14 months, Nyla's testimony, the name Harlan Veck. Mace listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the grain elevator behind Ryder, the way a man listens who is organizing information into operational categories while it's still coming in. Teller and Braid arrived within 10 minutes of each other. Teller Jane was 38, thin, ex-Marine, barely talked, and was the most competent man Ryder had ever ridden with in terms of staying alive in situations that argued against it. Braid Cutler was 46, had forearms like bridge cables, and had been with the club since before Ryder's presidency. Original iron, the kind of member whose presence in a room changed the weight distribution of it. They stood in the elevator building in the gray light that was beginning to come through the gaps in the corrugated walls, 4 men around a truck that held a child and the most operationally dangerous secret in 4 states. And Ryder laid it out again, complete, because they all needed the same picture. When he was done, Teller looked at the truck window where Nyla's face was barely visible. Kid's solid, Teller said, which from Teller was a significant character assessment. She is, Ryder said. What do we need? Braid said. He asked it the way Braid asked everything, which was as a logistics question, not a philosophical one. What do we need? Not should we do this, not what does it mean, not are we prepared to be in this. Just what do we need, because doing it was the assumed baseline. Safe house, Ryder said. Off-grid, not on any roll the club has filed anywhere. Nobody's aunt's cabin. Nobody's hunting lease that's on paper. We need a place that isn't traceable to us through any official route. I've got a place, Wren said from behind him. He'd come out of the truck without Ryder hearing him, which was either a sign of how tired Ryder was, or a sign of how carefully Wren moved. Not club adjacent. Old contact from before. 40 miles east, off a Forest Service road. No utilities, but there's a generator and it's stocked. I used it for about 3 months this past summer. You trust the contact? Mace said. She's dead, Wren said. Left it to nobody in her will. It's just sitting there. We'll need a second bike, Braid said. I've got a brother 12 miles from here who'll loan us something clean. Ryder nodded. It was coming together the way necessary things came together when the right people were in the room. Not smoothly, nothing about it was smooth, but with the particular accumulated competence of men who had spent years making fast decisions in constrained conditions. They divvied up the tasks. Teller went with Braid to get the second bike. Mace stayed with the truck. Wren went over the route to the Forest Service location. Ryder walked to the far end of the elevator building, where the light was coming through a long crack in the eastern wall, and made one more phone call. This one took longer to place because the number was in a different phone, the backup one he kept in the inside pocket of his cut, and when it rang 8 times before anyone answered. The voice on the other end was female, guarded, middle register, professional. Sorensen. Deputy Marshal Sorensen, Ryder said. This is Ryder Voss. You worked a task force out of Billings 4 years ago, protection detail for a witness in the Crestline indictment that went nowhere. I was the guy who rode in your motorcade for 3 days and you didn't know who cleared me to be there. A silence of approximately 2 seconds, which in conversational terms was a very long time. I remember, she said, I need a channel that doesn't go through Helena Field Office. Specifically, I need one that doesn't go through or to anything supervised by Harlan Veck. Another silence. Longer. That's a very serious name to say out loud, she said. I know. I've got a witness who can put him in a room, child witness, firsthand, clear on the detail. I've got about 48 hours before the people moving on us get their coordination together enough to close off my options. He could hear her breathing. He could hear, underneath it, the sound of a decision being made in real time. Where are you? She said. Not yet, he said. I need to know you're clean first. Tell me something that tells me you're clean. A pause, then. 4 years ago, after the motorcade, I filed an addendum to my after-action report. It said one of the uncleared motorcycles in the escort displayed iron revenance patches, and that I considered it a protocol breach. I was overruled by the SAC and told it was a cleared informal asset. I kept a copy of my addendum. He considered that. It was the right kind of thing to say. Specific, slightly unflattering to herself, easily verifiable. I'll contact you in 12 hours, he said. Don't run Veck's name through any searchable system before I do. He hung up and stood in the cracked wall light and listened to the grain elevator settle around him, the old steel ticking in the cold, and thought about what it meant to be here. What specific sequence of events in a specific man's life had to happen in a specific order to produce this exact moment? A man who became a biker because the structure of military service was the only structure he'd known, and the club was the only one left. A man who lost his daughter and stopped having reasons and started riding instead. A man who heard a child under a bridge on a night that was supposed to be just another empty night of riding through someone else's Montana. He thought about Emma. He thought about yellow dresses and how she'd been afraid of loud engines until she wasn't, until she was laughing at them, until she was asking him to rev it one more time just to hear it. He pressed his thumb into the cut on his palm until the pain came back sharp and clarifying. Then Mace's voice, from across the building, quiet and level. Ryder, come look at this. He walked back. Mace was holding his phone, and his expression was the expression of a man delivering news he would have preferred not to have. Club alert just went out, Mace said. 20 minutes ago. Your number is the origin. Ryder looked at him. I didn't send a club alert. No, Mace said. You didn't. He handed the phone over. The alert was routed through the club's encrypted network, tagged with Ryder's member identifier and his digital authorization key. The key that was stored on a device that was currently in the inside pocket of his cut, on his back, right now, which meant someone had either cloned his credentials at some previous point, or he checked his cut's inner pocket. The backup phone was there. The other item in that pocket, the small USB authentication fob that interfaced with the club's network, was gone. He thought back through every moment of the last 6 hours. The motel, the window, Ren coming through the door, the truck cab. His eyes went to Ren. Ren was reading his face and understanding what he was reading, and his expression shifted into something that wasn't guilt and wasn't quite denial, but was something in between that Ryder couldn't fully interpret. The alert, Ryder said carefully. What does it say? Mace read it. Emergency rally. All patched members. Ryder's position. He stopped. What position? Ryder's voice was very quiet. Mace turned the phone so he could see the screen, and there was a set of GPS coordinates. And when he looked at them, he recognized them, because they were the coordinates of the Harkin grain elevator. Someone had sent every member of the Iron Revenants to his location, including whoever was selling them out. And they were coming now, from every direction, on roads he no longer controlled, with 20 minutes already burned, and somewhere in the darkness between here and every point on the compass, the betrayer was riding toward him with the rest, indistinguishable until it was too late. And Nyla was in that truck, and the whole structure he'd been building for the last 6 hours had just been handed to the wrong person in the dark. And there was no version of the next 30 minutes where the ground didn't. Ryder moved before the thought fully completed itself. Truck. Now. He was already walking, not running. Running was noise. Running was panic. And panic was the thing that got people killed in the next 5 minutes, rather than giving them the chance to think their way to 6. He pulled Mace by the arm as he passed him, and said one word against his ear. Scatter. Then he was at the truck door, and Ren was already on the passenger side, and Nyla was awake in the back seat with her eyes fully open, reading the room the way she'd learned to read rooms, which was immediately and without illusion. We're moving, Ryder said. He started the engine. What happened? Nyla said. Someone called the whole club to this location. He reversed out from behind the elevator machinery, headlights still off, navigating by the pale gray of the pre-dawn coming through the building's open south face. Someone who has access to my credentials. He felt her process that in the back seat. No panic, no sound, just the quality of silence that was itself a kind of intelligence. Teller and Braid were outside already, having heard the engine. These were men who moved on engine sounds the way other men moved on spoken commands. Ryder rolled down the window and spoke to Braid in the passing second as the truck came alongside. GPS coordinates of this location just went out on the club network under my ID, he said. 20 minutes ago. Could have members converging from any direction. Could also have whatever's riding with them. Braid's face did a single thing. A compression of the jaw, barely visible in the gray light. And then it was done, and he was already turning to Teller, with his eyes doing the talking. The second bike? Ryder said. 15 minutes out, Braid said. My brother's running it over. Cancel it. Don't call from your registered number. Use the drop phone. Tell him to turn back. Tell him nothing else. Ryder looked at him for 1 second longer. I don't know who sent that alert, Braid. I don't know if it was someone in that crowd coming this way or someone already in this yard. So I'm going to need you to sit with that and make your own judgment about who's standing next to you right now. Braid looked at Teller. Teller looked at nobody in particular. Clean, Teller said, flatly, not defending himself, declaring a status the way a gauge declares a pressure level. Yeah, Braid said, the same register. Okay, Ryder said. East on the service road 2 miles, there's a creek crossing. Wait there. Don't use the network. I'll come to you. He drove. The service road east of the Harkin facility was 2 dirt ruts through dormant field grass, and the truck found every frozen hole in it, jolting and grinding in the pre-dawn gray, and Ryder kept the headlights off and drove by the lightening sky on his left and the dark mass of a tree line on his right, and the compass in his gut that 11 years of rural Montana roads had developed into something close to instrument-grade accuracy. Beside him, Wren hadn't spoken. Ryder spoke first. The fob. Wren didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the tree line. The authentication fob for my cut, Ryder said. It was there when I came into the elevator. It wasn't there when Mace showed me the alert. Walk me through who had access to my cut in that window. You're asking if I took it. I'm asking you to walk me through who had access. It's the same question. Ryder said nothing. He drove. The creek crossing appeared ahead as a depression in the field, and he slowed and took it carefully, the truck's front end dropping and then climbing, water brushing the undercarriage. Wren turned to face him properly. His expression was complicated. Not the clean face of a man with nothing to hide, not the specific tight architecture of a man who is guilty and managing it. Something harder to read than either of those, something that had several layers to it, and the top layer was something that looked very much against the grain of the situation, like grief. I didn't take the fob, Wren said, but I know when it went. Tell me. When we were outside the elevator, when you called Sorensen, I walked around the south side of the building. I needed air. I needed 2 minutes where I wasn't in an enclosed space. I've been having... It doesn't matter. He stopped. Reorganized. I walked around the south side, and when I came back, your cut was hanging on the truck's side mirror. You'd taken it off when you pulled the bandage out of the kit. Ryder remembered. He'd hung the cut on the mirror to get to the first aid supplies in the bag behind the seat. Maybe 4 minutes. Maybe 5. I came back through the north side, Wren said, which means there was a window of 3-4 minutes where the cut was on the mirror. You were on the phone on the far end of the building. I was on the south side, and he looked at the back seat. Nyla was watching them. And the truck cab was unoccupied, Ryder said slowly. Nyla's expression shifted by a degree that was nearly imperceptible, but Ryder had been watching faces for a long time, and he saw it. Nyla, he said. I didn't take anything, she said. Firm, direct. I know, Ryder said. Because he did know. A 10-year-old girl with a broken ankle in a stolen truck at a derelict grain elevator at 5 in the morning did not have the operational sophistication to clone an authentication fob and push a message through an encrypted club network. That was not the answer here. But someone else was near the truck, Ryder said. Not a question. The smallest pause. A man came around the side of the building, she said. I thought he was one of yours. He was wearing a cut. Ryder felt the cold settle through him that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. What did he look like? Older than you, white beard. He walked up to the truck and he stood there for maybe a minute, and he was looking at your cut on the mirror, and I stayed down because he wasn't one of the 3 you introduced me to, and I didn't know. Her jaw tightened. The guilt in it was a child's guilt, the specific torment of, I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry. I didn't know if he was supposed to be there. You have nothing to be sorry for, Ryder said, immediately and absolutely. Nothing. You did exactly right. He looked at Wren. White beard, older. He knew exactly one Iron Revenants member who matched that description, who would have known about the Harkin facility as a possible rally point, who had, in fact, been the one to suggest Harkin as an emergency location 3 years prior, at a church run that ended with a broken-down prospect and a need for shelter. One member who was old enough and trusted enough to travel under the club network without raising flags. One member who sat on the inner council and had therefore been present for every strategic conversation the club had held in the last decade. Dutch Reyes? Road name Dutch. Legal name Aurelio Reyes. 63 years old. Founding member. The man who had sponsored Ryder for his patch. Ryder sat with that knowledge for approximately 3 seconds and then put it somewhere functional and drove. The creek crossing behind him, the truck on a faint track through field grass, the sky going from charcoal to a bruised gray-purple that would eventually become dawn, but wasn't there yet. He drove east and thought about Dutch Reyes, who had been at Emma's funeral, who had put a hand on Ryder's shoulder at the graveside and said nothing, same as Mace, same as all of them, because there was nothing to say. Who had ridden next to him on the first day Ryder got back on a bike after the hospital, 18 months after Emma, keeping pace without pushing, without talking, just present on the road beside him, the way only a brother understood to be. He thought about what it costs a man to do what Dutch had apparently done. He thought about the specific kind of corruption that didn't start all at once but eroded. The first small thing, the rationalization, the next thing, slightly larger, and then the architecture of it holding you up the way debt holds up a building, until the building and the debt are the same structure and you can't take one out without the other collapsing. He wondered how long. He wondered what they'd paid, or what they'd threatened, or what combination of both had gotten Dutch Reyes's hands into something that put children in vans. He wondered if Dutch knew, really knew, what the network was, what it moved. Then he thought about Nyla jumping from a moving van with a broken ankle and stopped wondering about Dutch's level of knowledge. The track ended at a belt of pines, and beyond the pines was a two-lane blacktop that he recognized as Route 12, and Ryder stopped at the tree line and killed the engine, and they sat in the cold and the silence. "I need to use your phone," Ryder said to Wren. "Mine is compromised if they've been monitoring the club network long enough to clone credentials. They have the number." Wren handed it over. He called Mace. "You're clear?" was the first thing he said. "Running south on 12, Mace said. "Alone. Nobody's tailed me that I can see. Ryder, there are bikes coming in from the north on Route 9 and the east on Mill Road. At least 6. I can't read cuts in the dark." "Don't go back to the elevator," Ryder said. "Keep south. I'm going to give you a location in a minute." "Who sent that alert?" Ryder looked at the pines in front of the truck. The light was coming up behind him very slowly, turning the frost on the needles from black to silver. "Dutch," he said. The silence on Mace's end was a specific kind of silence, the kind that comes when a thing you half knew becomes a thing you fully know, and the having can't happen anymore. "Say that again," Mace said. His voice was very flat. "White beard. Older than me." Nyla saw him at the truck. "He was the one who picked the Harkin location 3 years ago, Mace. He had access to my credentials because he was standing 20 feet from my cut for 4 minutes while I was on the phone. Dutch has been with this club since before either of us had patches." "I know." "He came to Emma's—" "Mace," Ryder stopped him. "I know, and I'm telling you anyway, because the only thing worse than it being Dutch is acting like it isn't Dutch, and having someone walk through a door they shouldn't be allowed near." He paused. "Where is he right now? Is he on the network?" The sound of a phone being moved, keys being checked. "He pinged the network from a location north of Calvert 40 minutes ago," Mace said. "Moving south." Toward the elevator, toward where Ryder had been, which meant Dutch had sent the alert and was now riding in with the others as if he were just another member responding to an emergency call. "Okay," Ryder said. "Okay. Here's what we do." He thought quickly and cleanly, the way he'd learned to think in rooms and in vehicles and on roads, when the margin for error had collapsed to nothing, which was a skill that came from particular kinds of experience and could not be taught by any other means. He had a truck that was stolen from a grain facility and would be reported missing when the facility opened, which in November in this county might be 8 a.m. or might be 11 a.m. He had 3 men he trusted, Mace, Teller, Braid, running separate vectors in the dark. He had Wren, whose history included 14 months he couldn't fully account for, and one specific act of leaving the club without explanation, but whose behavior in the last 6 hours had been consistent with someone protecting the child rather than compromising her. He had Nyla, who was 10 years old and had a broken ankle and more composure under sustained threat than most adults he'd ridden with. He had a contact at the U.S. Marshals who had given him one piece of verifiable trust and whom he needed 12 more hours to be sure of. He had no clean phones, no safe location yet, and somewhere to his north a founding member of his club was riding south with whatever intentions Dutch Reyes had arrived at in the dark, private place where a man decided his brothers were worth less than whatever he'd been given, and converging from multiple directions, 6 or more bikes carrying members who had responded to the alert in good faith, some of whom might be clean, and some of whom Dutch might have been feeding information to for months or years, and no way yet to know which was which. "Teller and Braid," Ryder said to Mace. "Get them on the drop phones. Route 12, mile marker 34, there's an equipment barn on the east side. Old Fenwick property. Gate's never been locked. Get them there. Get yourself there. 20 minutes. And Dutch? Let him come to the elevator. Let him find it empty. And then?" Then he'll make a call to someone who isn't us, Ryder said. And when he does, he'll tell them we're gone, and the people who are hunting Nyla will know they've lost the fix on us. That buys us time. Not much, but some. He hung up and looked at Ren. Ren was already looking at him. His expression had settled into something stripped down and functional, the way faces go when the psychological overhead of managing appearances has been dropped in the interest of survival. The Forest Service cabin, Ryder said. How far? 40 miles east, maybe 45. The Forest Service road isn't passable in this truck. The track is too narrow and too rough. We'd need bikes. We've got one. One won't carry 3. Ryder looked at the back seat. Nyla was watching him with those dark, measuring eyes. We get to Fenwick, he said. We get the brothers. We consolidate. We figure out the bike situation. And we move before the sun is fully up. He started the engine and pulled out onto Route 12, heading south. They made Fenwick in 11 minutes. The equipment barn was a steel-sided structure set back from the road behind a rusted pipe gate that swung open when Ryder pushed it. And inside, among the hibernating implements of a farm operation, a large tractor, a hay baler wrapped in orange tarp, a PTO spreader on its jack stands. They parked the truck and waited in the cold and the smell of motor oil and old hay and the specific darkness of a building that had been closed against winter. Nyla sat on an overturned fuel container near the tractor and said nothing. Ren stood at the barn's side door, watching the road through a 6-inch gap. Ryder paced the length of the barn 3 times and stopped at the north wall and put both hands flat against the cold steel and stood there, not thinking about Emma, not thinking about Dutch, not thinking about anything except the map in his head, and the routes, and the daylight coming, and the ticking of a clock he couldn't see. Mace came in through the gate at 6:12. Teller 2 minutes behind him. Braid at 6:17 with 2 bikes instead of 1, his own and a second Softail that had to have been the brother's loan that Ryder had told him to cancel, which meant Braid had used his judgment about the cancellation and arrived at a different conclusion, which under the circumstances was the right conclusion, and Ryder was not going to take issue with it. They stood in a loose cluster in the barn, 5 men, 2 motorcycles, 1 truck, 1 child, no good options, just the hierarchy of bad ones. Mace looked at Ren for a long time before he spoke. You want to tell me why you came back? Mace said. Not to Ryder, to Ren directly. I came back for the same reason Ryder stayed when Emma died instead of riding off somewhere permanent, Ren said. Because you don't leave the thing that made you into a version of yourself you can stand. Mace held his look for another 3 seconds. Then, to Ryder. I believe him. I know, Ryder said. I do too. He moved to the center of the group. Here's where we are. Dutch Reyes has been feeding operational information to the network that's hunting Nyla. We don't know for how long, we don't know what else he's compromised. We don't know the full scope of what they have from him. We know he cloned my credentials and called every patched member to a location that would have had us surrounded. We know the network has law enforcement cover at the federal level. Nyla's testimony puts Harlan Vec, the Helena SAC, inside one of their facilities. We know they have contractors, not just cops. The SUVs at the motel were private, no insignia. What we have is a contact at the U.S. Marshals Service who is outside Vec's chain of supervision. 12 hours to establish her as clean, 1 child who is the only living witness to any of this, and 4 brothers I trust. No one spoke for a moment. Then Braid said, What do we do with Dutch? It was not a complicated question. The way Braid asked it, it was a logistics question, the same as all his questions. But underneath the logistics was the weight of what the question actually meant. What you do with a founding member of your club who has been selling children's safety for whatever Dutch Reyes had been given in return. A man who sat at the head of the table at every church meeting, who wore the same patch on his back that all of them wore, who had for years been one of the definitions of what the revenants were supposed to mean. He comes to us, Ryder said. Everyone looked at him. We let him think the alert worked, Ryder said. We let him think he's herded us somewhere. Then we control where that somewhere is. When he arrives where we want him, somewhere of our choosing, not his, we have a conversation. Teller looked at him with those flat, very pale eyes. What kind of conversation? The kind that gets us everything he knows about the network's structure. Their contacts, their locations, their timelines, Ryder said. Everything he's given them, and everything he knows about what they've done with it. All of it. Because Nyla's testimony puts Vec in a room. Dutch's information can put the rest of them in a federal courtroom. Mace was quiet. Then, he won't give that up easy. No, Ryder said. He won't. Another silence, different in quality from the ones before it. This one had weight to it. The weight of men deciding, collectively and without speaking the decision aloud, what they were and what they were willing to be in the specific service of a specific necessity. I'll make the call, Ryder said. He's my sponsor. If this is going to be said, I'll say it. He took Wren's phone again and dialed Dutch's number, which he'd had for 11 years and knew without looking. It rang twice. Brother, Dutch's voice. Same as always, deep, a little rough, carrying the habitual warmth of a man who had made himself the social center of every room he'd been in for 30 years. I heard the alert. I'm coming in. Where are you? Ryder listened to the voice and cataloged every element of it. The warmth, the steadiness, the total absence of guilt in the register, which was itself a kind of information about how long Dutch had been doing this, because a man who could carry that warmth while doing what Dutch had done had been carrying it for long enough that it no longer cost him anything. Change of plan, Ryder said. Elevators exposed. Come to the Rennick Depot. The Rennick Depot was an abandoned rail switching station 12 miles west of Calvert, a place the club had used exactly once 4 years ago, and which was not on any current operational map. Dutch knew it because Dutch knew everything the club had ever used. Rennick, Dutch said. All right. How long? 40 minutes, Ryder said. Come alone. It's sensitive. Of course, brother. He hung up. The word brother sat in his mouth like a piece of glass. He'd been called brother by Dutch Reyes for 11 years, and he'd meant it both ways, Val. The club meaning and the real meaning, and he'd believed it was meant back at him in both ways. And he was standing now in a cold equipment barn with the first full light of morning starting to press through the gaps in the steel walls. And he was understanding something about the particular damage done by a betrayal that comes from inside the meaning of a word rather than outside it. He looked at Nyla. She was watching him from her perch on the fuel container, the broken ankle elevated slightly on the tractor's front tire, the ace bandage starting to show the pressure of the swelling beneath it. How's the ankle? He said. Hurts, she said. I'm okay. We're going to get you somewhere safe, he said. It's going to take a few more hours, and it's going to be uncomfortable. Can you do uncomfortable for a few more hours? She looked at him steadily. I jumped out of a moving van, she said. Yeah, he said. You did. Something moved in his chest. He turned away before she could see what it did to his face. He sent Teller and Braid ahead to the Rennick Depot on the 2 bikes. Approach from the south, set up overwatch, report on what was there before Dutch arrived. Mace would take the truck with Nyla and come in from the east on the old access road that ran behind the depot's southern wall. Ryder and Wren would approach from the north on foot after leaving the truck at the mile 34 marker, which gave them cover of approach that a vehicle couldn't provide. They moved at 6:41. The walk north was a mile and a half across frozen fields and a stretch of scrub pine that grabbed at every exposed surface and left scratches on the backs of his hands and the side of his neck. Wren moved beside him in silence, both of them keeping the stride rate low enough to prevent heavy breathing, which was a thing you learned in the same kinds of places and came out knowing the same way. The sky was fully light now. Colorless, white-gray, the sun somewhere behind a cloud layer that showed no intention of lifting. The frost on the field grass crunched under their boots with every step, a sound that carried further than Ryder liked, but there was no road between them and the depot, and the sound had nowhere to go except into the cold, empty air. What did they give him? Wren said quietly. Not a question exactly, more the shape of a thought spoken out into the available space. I don't know yet. Money, or something they had on him, Ryder said. Something old. Dutch has things in his past the same as every man who's lived 63 years sideways of the law. They find the right thing and they don't even need to pay you. They just need to hold it. Wren walked 4 more steps. Is that better or worse? I don't know, Ryder said. I used to think coercion was better than choice. Now I think it might be worse because at least a choice is a thing you made. Coercion is a thing that was made of you. Wren didn't answer that. They walked. The Rennick Depot came into view through the last stand of scrub pine, a long, low building of old brick and board, the roof partially caved at the western end, the rail lines that had once served it pulled up decades ago and leaving only the ghost of their geometry in the frozen ground as two parallel lines of depression running east-west behind the building. The windows had been boarded for years, and the boards had grayed and warped but held. One vehicle entrance on the south side, a wide industrial door on rollers, currently rolled open about 3 feet. Teller's work, Ryder knew, because Teller had a facility with old mechanisms that came from the same patient precision he brought to everything. Teller's voice in his earpiece, the short range he'd distributed them from the bag before they'd split up. Clear inside. Old loading dock in the back. Ceiling is partial but standing. Braid's got north coverage from the roof of the outbuilding. Vehicle approach road is visible from my position. Copy, Ryder said. He touched Wren's arm and they came in through a gap in the eastern wall where the brickwork had crumbled at ground level, stepping through into the depot's interior, cold that was somehow colder than outside, the way long-closed buildings held their cold like a moral position. The floor was old concrete, cracked and heaved, and their boots on it sounded flat and dense in the enclosed space. Light came through the boards in thin lines. Mace brought the truck in at 7:04, backing it to the loading dock. Nyla came out of the truck on her own, refusing help with a single look that communicated very clearly that she had been helped enough and was capable of hopping 8 feet on 1 foot if required, and sat on the dock's edge with her back against the building's interior wall. Dutch Reyes arrived at 7:22. Ryder heard the bike first, the specific sound of Dutch's Road King, which ran a slightly different pipe configuration than stock, a quarter note lower in its idle. He heard it come in off the county road, slow through the approach lane, stop outside the vehicle door. Then the sound of a kickstand, then boots on concrete, Dutch stepping through the gap in the door with a flashlight in his left hand even though it was no longer needed, and Ryder thought about that. The flashlight as prop, as gesture of innocence. A man arriving at a meeting with a flashlight because that's what a man honestly responding to an emergency call would carry. Dutch swept the light around and found Ryder standing in the center of the floor and stopped. His eyes moved from Ryder to Mace on the right, to Teller near the wall, to Wren behind Ryder. And on Wren they stopped for a fraction of a second longer than they should have, and Ryder saw the recalibration happen in real time, the micro-adjustment of a man who had expected a certain configuration and found a different one. "Quite a gathering," Dutch said. His voice was exactly the same. Still warm, still steady, still containing, somehow, the infrastructure of a persona that had been built over decades and could apparently withstand this. Could apparently withstand standing in a room where the men who trusted him for years were arranged around him in a geometry that was not casual. "Close the door," Ryder said. Dutch turned and rolled the vehicle door down, and the sound of it closing echoed in the brick interior and then died. And then there was silence, except for the cold. Dutch turned back. The flashlight was still in his hand, down at his side, switched off now. His white beard was wet from the ride. His cut had the full complement of patches: founding member rocker, inner council tab, 11 years of road pins along the bottom. And in the dim interior light, it looked the same as it had always looked, the same as the cut Ryder wore, the same as any of them. And that sameness was its own particular cruelty this morning. Ryder said, "The Latimer Motel, Route 7, last night." Dutch waited. "Someone sent those SUVs there," Ryder said. "Someone who knew I was using that motel. The only people who knew were in this building right now, Dutch. And you, because I told Mace on a call that I made from Dunette's. And Mace told you because you were in the room with him at the club. That's the chain." Dutch said nothing. "The fob," Ryder said. A very small shift in Dutch's face. The first one. "The authentication fob that generated the club alert under my credentials," Ryder said. "Nyla saw you at the truck. She described you." Dutch looked past Ryder at Nyla, where she sat on the dock's edge, and the look was the first thing that cracked something open in Ryder's chest, Because it was not a cold look, not the look of a man looking at an obstacle. It was something more terrible than that. It was the look of a man who recognized the full weight of what he'd done and had been successfully not looking at it for a long time and was now, for the first time, looking at it in the form of a 10-year-old girl with a broken ankle on a loading dock in an abandoned building in November. "How long?" Ryder said. Dutch closed his eyes, opened them. 3 years, he said. The number landed in the room like something dropped from a significant height. 3 years, which meant before Emma, which meant Dutch Reyes had been feeding information to a network that trafficked children while sitting at Ryder's table during the worst year of Ryder's life, while Emma was sick, and then while she died, and then while Ryder came back from the dead end of grief and rebuilt himself into something functional, and Dutch had been there for all of it, the hand on the shoulder at the graveside, the road captain keeping pace on the first ride back, 3 years of it running underneath like a current in dark water. Braid made a sound in his throat that was the most controlled version of what Braid was capable of making in that moment. Teller had gone absolutely still, which was somehow more alarming than any sound. "They had something on you," Ryder said. "Flat. Or they paid you." "Both," Dutch said. He wasn't performing composure anymore. He'd stopped somewhere between the question and the answer, stopped managing the surface of it. What was on his face now was something rawer and harder to look at. Not quite remorse, because remorse implied it could have been otherwise. And Ryder wasn't sure anything about Dutch's face right now was claiming it could have been otherwise. They found something from before the club, a long time before. It would have ended everything, not just for me. What does that mean? "I have a son," Dutch said. "Not in the club, not in this life. He's 31, he's got a family, he's got a normal life in Portland, and he has no idea what his father is. They found out about him. They said they would—" His voice went flat, and then stopped, and then came back differently. "They said they would send what they had to his employer, his wife, his neighbors, everything from before the club, everything." Ryder looked at him. He understood the mechanics of it. He understood, in the abstract, how a man could be driven by it. He'd spent 11 years watching Dutch Reyes be a certain kind of man, and knowing that kind of man had a cost and a history, the same way they all did. He understood. Understanding it made no difference. "You knew what they were moving," Ryder said. Dutch was silent. "Dutch, you knew what they were moving." "I told myself the information I gave was operational. Routes, patrol schedules, club movements. I told myself I wasn't—" He stopped. "You were," Ryder said. "Whatever you told yourself, you were." Dutch looked at the floor. The flashlight hung at his side. The room was very cold and very quiet, and the thin lines of light came through the boards and across the old concrete, and everyone in it stood exactly where they were. Then Nyla's voice came from the loading dock, and it came out with the precision of a child who has thought very carefully about whether to speak and decided that this is the moment. "There were 8 of us in the van," she said. "There have been more. There are more right now, somewhere." She wasn't accusing, she was informing. Her voice was the voice of a girl who had already cried all the tears that were available for this particular subject and had moved past them into something harder and colder and more useful. "I need you to understand that, before anything else happens in this room. I need you to understand that there are other kids who are where I was." Dutch looked at her. His face did something that Ryder could not fully read and did not try to. "Tell us everything," Ryder said to Dutch. "Every contact, every route, every name, every location, everything they've told you about their operation, everything you've observed, everything you've given them, and how they used it. All of it." Dutch looked at him. "And then?" Dutch said. "And then we use it to get those kids back," Ryder said. "That's what happens next. Everything after that is a different conversation." Dutch Reyes looked around the room, at Mace, whose face was a door that had been shut and would not be opening again on anything warm, at Teller, who had not moved in 4 minutes, at Braid, whose stillness was the stillness of something under very high pressure, at Wren, who was watching Dutch with the eyes of a man who had spent 14 months in the proximity of this network and knew exactly what Dutch's 3 years of information had made possible. And then Dutch looked back at Ryder. He sat down on the concrete floor. Not in a chair, not on a surface, on the floor, The way a man sits down when he's done standing under a particular weight and has arrived at the end of the particular stance that weight required. And then Dutch Reyes started talking, and what came out of him in that cold, abandoned depot, in the full white light of a November morning, was not a confession so much as an inventory. Names, dates, routes, coordinates, contact methods, hierarchy, funding structures, the name of a building in 2 locations, a ranch outside of Havre, a warehouse near Shelby, and Ryder listened to every word of it and understood, as Dutch spoke, that they were no longer in a situation where the right move was to stay quiet and stay mobile. They were in a situation where the only move left was to go forward directly and immediately into the full weight of what Dutch was describing, and that Nyla Reed, 10 years old, was not just a witness to be protected, but the reason the whole structure was finally breakable, because she had heard a name in a room, and that name connected a federal law enforcement officer to a network that had operated for years on the assumption that no child would survive long enough to say it out loud. She had survived. She had said it. And now Ryder Voss, who had been riding empty roads for 3 years because there was nothing left in him that believed in destinations, picked up Ren's phone and called Evelyn Sorensen and said, "I'm ready to talk. All of it. But we move tonight." Because there were kids in a ranch outside Havre who did not have until morning, and the man who had just told him where they were was sitting on a concrete floor with his face in his hands. And the only thing left to decide was what a man who had ridden empty roads for 3 years was actually capable of when the road finally led to something that mattered enough to reach the end of. Sorensen picked up on the second ring. "Talk," she said. "I have a source with 3 years of internal operational data on the network," Ryder said. "Names, locations, contact chains, funding routes. I have a child witness who can place Harlan Vec inside a facility, and I have a ranch outside Havre with children in it right now who won't be there by tomorrow morning if we don't move tonight." The silence on her end lasted exactly 4 seconds. "How many children?" "Unknown. At least 7 from the van Nyla was in, possibly more already on site." "How good is your source?" Ryder looked at Dutch, sitting on the concrete floor. Dutch was looking at nothing, at the middle distance of a man who had put everything down and was sitting with the weight of what putting it down revealed about how long he'd been carrying it. "Good enough," Ryder said. "But the information has a shelf life. If the network detects that their contact inside my club has gone quiet, they'll move the children. They may already be moving them. I need coordinates. You get coordinates when I know your operation is sealed from Vec's chain. That means no Helena field office, no regional SAC notification, no JTTF channels that run through federal infrastructure he can monitor. Can you do that?" Another silence, longer. "I have a task force contact at DOJ," she said. "Internal Affairs Division, not field. They've had Vec flagged for 18 months on a separate matter. Financial irregularities, nothing they could move on. If I bring them what you have, they can seal the operation under a DOJ umbrella that Vec can't touch." "How fast?" 2 hours to get authorization, maybe less." "You have 90 minutes, Ryder said. "After that, the operational window closes." He hung up and looked at Mace. "We're going to Havre," Ryder said. "All of us." Mace didn't blink. "That's 4 hours north. 3.5 if we push it. On 2 bikes and a stolen truck. We pick up bikes on the way. Tell her." He turned. "You've got a contact in Great Falls. The guy with the shop on Industrial." "Korvath," Teller said. "He owes me something significant." "Call it in. We need 3 roadworthy machines waiting when we pass through. We don't stop. We pick them up moving." Teller already had his phone out. Braid had come down from the outbuilding roof and was standing at the depot's vehicle door, and he had the look he always had when things were about to require the full version of him. A settling like a structure taking on the load it was designed for, every component finding its bearing. "The ranch," Braid said. "What are we walking into?" Dutch's voice came from the floor. "Security detail of 8, possibly 12 on a transfer night, and tonight is a transfer night. I know because I was contacted 4 days ago and asked to confirm that the Revenant's patrol routes in the northern corridor would be clear. I confirmed it." Nobody looked at Dutch when he said this. The information was received and the source of it was not engaged with, because engaging with it in the time available was not possible and was not useful. "Armed?" Braid said. Yes, contractors, ex-military, some of them. The operation pays well. The man running the physical security at the ranch is named Cord Duval. He was a sergeant in a private security firm that did contract work in 3 different conflict zones. He's not, Dutch paused. He's not someone who hesitates. Ryder thought about that. 8 to 12 armed contractors who did not hesitate against 5 bikers, a deputy U.S. Marshal, and whatever DOJ could bring in 90 minutes to a ranch in northern Montana. Sorensen will have federal credentials, Wren said, reading the geometry of it. That changes the entry parameters. If she arrives with DOJ authorization, the contractors have a legal problem shooting at a federal operation. Some of them won't care, Teller said flatly. No, Wren agreed. Some of them won't. Ryder looked at Nyla. She had been listening to all of it from the loading dock, and her expression was the expression of a child who understood that what was being planned in direct consequence of her existence, which was both a weight and a form of agency, and she was holding both of them without flinching. You're not coming to the ranch, he said. I know, she said. Sorensen takes you direct from here. Different route, different destination. A federal safe house that doesn't come through Vec's network. And you? He looked at her for a moment. The broken ankle, the borrowed blanket someone had found in the truck's cab and put around her shoulders at some point in the last hour. The dark eyes that had been assessing him since the bridge and had apparently, somewhere along the way, arrived at a verdict. I'm going to get the other kids back, he said. She nodded once, like a period at the end of a sentence that had been a long time coming. Sorensen arrived at the Rennick Depot at 8:41 in an unmarked Suburban with government plates and a second vehicle behind her, a black sedan carrying 2 DOJ internal affairs agents named Price and Weatherall, who had the look of men who had been awake for 36 hours on different work and were now fully awake on this work. The kind of awakeness that comes from a case that just broke open in a direction you'd been waiting for. She was 43, medium height, brown hair pulled back, wearing a vest over a jacket and carrying herself with the particular economy of motion of someone who had spent years making fast decisions and had stopped wasting energy on anything that wasn't the next decision. She looked at Ryder when she came through the door, and looked at Nyla, and looked at Dutch still on the floor, and looked at the assembled brothers, and completed her assessment in approximately 8 seconds. Vec has been flagged, she said to Ryder. DOJ has assumed jurisdiction. His network access was quietly suspended 40 minutes ago. He doesn't know yet. When he figures it out, we have about 20 minutes before he burns whatever he can reach. Then we move now, Ryder said. I need the child. Nyla slid off the dock edge and hopped 2 steps toward Sorensen and stopped and looked back at Ryder. One look. It contained several things. A form of trust that had been built in the worst possible conditions. A form of gratitude that was too large and too complicated to be expressed in any of the words available to a 10-year-old. And something else underneath both of those that Ryder recognized only because he'd felt it himself in the specific form it took when you'd been alone in something terrible for so long that the presence of one person who simply showed up was almost more than the architecture of your chest could hold. He crossed to her. He crouched down to her level, same as he had on the riverbank, hands where she could see them. You're going to be okay, he said. I know, she said. Go get them. He stood and nodded to Sorensen, and Sorensen put a careful hand on Nyla's shoulder and walked her toward the door, and Ryder watched them go and then turned back to the room and to the work. They were on the road by 9:15. The 2 bikes and the truck ran north on Route 89, pushing the speed limit by 15 and accepting the risk of it because the alternative risk was larger. The morning was fully white now, overcast and cold, the temperature sitting at 26 degrees with a wind from the northwest that hit exposed skin on the bikes like something with intent. Ryder rode the Softail that had been Braid's brother's loan and felt the cold through every layer and focused on the white line and the distance and the arithmetic of hours and miles. Teller had reached Corvath, 3 bikes waiting in Great Falls at a shop on Industrial Boulevard, keys in the ignitions, no questions asked, and no paperwork to create a trail. They picked them up at 11:03, Ryder transferring to a blacked-out Road King that felt better under him than anything had felt since last night, and now they were 5 bikes and the truck running north, and the truck held Dutch, who had chosen to come, and Wren, who had chosen to ride in the truck rather than on a bike for reasons that he didn't explain, and nobody asked him to. Sorensen was running a parallel route with Nyla and Price. Weatherall was coordinating with a federal rapid response unit out of Great Falls that was converging on the Havre area from the east. 12 agents, 2 tactical vehicles, moving under complete radio silence on Sorensen's authority. The ranch was called the Blackwater property in county records. 1,800 acres of high country grassland and scrub pine southwest of Havre, with a main house, 2 outbuildings, and what Dutch described as a converted barn structure that did not appear in the county's building records because it had been constructed after the last survey update, and its permit had been handled by a county official whose name was also on Dutch's list. They stopped once, at a rest area 30 miles south of Havre, for 3 minutes. Fuel from a spare can Braid had strapped to his bike. 2 minutes of standing in the cold wind eating protein bars from someone's jacket pocket. Ryder looked at his brothers, Mace, Teller, Braid, and now Wren, who had come out of the truck and was standing with them, and thought about the specific texture of this, the way this moment felt different from every other moment of mobilization he'd experienced in 11 years of riding with these men. Different because it wasn't about the club. It wasn't about territory or reputation or the slow institutional business of being an outlaw organization operating in the margins of a society that didn't know what to do with them. It was about a barn in northern Montana that contained children, and the men standing in the wind at a highway rest stop eating protein bars were going toward it because there was nobody else going toward it fast enough. Cord Duval, Ryder said. Dutch says he's the one running security. If this goes sideways at the gate, Duval is the decision maker on their side, which means he's the one we need to isolate. Or remove, Teller said. Sorensen's people handle the takedowns, Ryder said. We are there to make the path and hold it. We do not shoot first. We do not shoot unless it is the only remaining option, and we do not give anyone a reason to classify this as anything other than a federal operation with civilian assistance. Braid looked at him with the calm of a man who had already accepted every version of what tonight might require. And if they shoot first, then we finish it, Ryder said. But they shoot first. They remounted. The rest stop fell behind them, and the highway unrolled north into the high country, the landscape flattening and widening into the vast open geometry of northern Montana, where the sky came all the way down to the ground in every direction, and there was nowhere to hide and nowhere to be hidden from, and Ryder rode through it with his teeth against the cold and his hands solid on the bars, and the engine of the Road King speaking through the frame and into his palms and his chest and his thighs, in the specific language of machines that had been with him longer than most people. At 1:17 p.m., they turned off the paved county road onto a gravel access road, and at 1:22 the access road crested a low rise and the Blackwater property came into view below them. Ryder stopped the bike on the rise, and the others stopped behind him, and they looked. The main house was a substantial 2-story structure of wood and stone, lights on in several windows despite the afternoon. 2 black SUVs parked at the front, the same model, the same non-markings as the ones at the Latimer Motel. The converted barn was southeast of the main house, a large structure whose new construction was visible even from this distance, in the way the roofline was too clean and the siding too uniform relative to the weathered outbuildings flanking it. A man was posted at the barn's exterior door. Another was visible walking the perimeter of the main house. From this distance and angle, Ryder could see 2 more near the SUVs, both of them oriented outward, watching the access road. They'd been seen on the rise. "Back off the ridge," Ryder said, and they dropped below the crest line on the bikes, and Wren brought the truck down behind a scrub pine break on the road's east side. Ryder pulled out the phone. Sorensen. "We're on site, Uset," he said. "They've got eyes on the access road. Your vehicles are going to be made from half a mile out." "My tactical team is 4 minutes east on the county road," she said. "We come in simultaneous, yeah. You from the west on the access road, my team from the east across the open ground. Split their attention. The barn has 1 exterior guard that I can see. There may be more inside." "My priority is the barn," she said. "Your priority is the main house. Keep Duval's security occupied and out of my team's path to that building. Can you do that?" Ryder looked back at his brothers. "Yes." 4 minutes, she said. "Then we move. Together." He put the phone away and turned to them, and in the cold wind at the side of a gravel road in northern Montana, he looked at each of them in turn. Mace, who had ridden beside him for 11 years. Teller, who had carried him out of Spokane. Braid, who had never once in the years Ryder had known him done a thing at less than its full requirement. Wren, who had come back from 14 months in the dark, and was standing here because the thing the darkness had been about was standing in a barn 200 yards south of this road. "We run in through the front," Ryder said, loud. "All 5 bikes, full throttle, straight up the access road and into that front yard. We want everyone in that house looking at us. We want Duvall out of the barn," and pointed at the road. "Every second they're watching us is a second Sorensen's team has to reach those kids." "And when they stop watching us and start shooting at us," Mace said. "We don't give them a clean shot," Ryder said. "We stay mobile, we stay between them and the barn, and we do not stop moving." 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, Ryder Voss brought the Road King over the ridge at full throttle, and the other 4 bikes came over with him in a spread formation, and the sound of it, 5 Harleys at full run down a gravel road in the cold afternoon air of northern Montana, was a sound that went into your chest and stayed there, a sound that was part mechanical and part something older than mechanical, the sound of men committed past the point of return and moving at the speed the commitment required. The 2 men near the SUVs heard it and turned, and for a half second, they were just men watching motorcycles come down a road, which was half a second too long, because in that half second, the 5 bikes hit the front yard of the Blackwater property and spread into a fan across the gravel, and Ryder brought the Road King broadside in a controlled skid that put the bike between him and the nearest man and threw gravel in a wide arc. And the sound of it was enormous in the open space. Someone shouted from the house. A door opened. 3 men came out of the front of the main house moving fast, and Ryder got a snapshot of Cord Duvall in the center. He knew it was Duvall because Dutch had described him, and the description was specific: big, late 40s, close-cropped gray hair, moving with the weight-forward posture of a man who had been trained to close distance rather than create it. Duvall had a weapon at his side, and his eyes were doing the right things. Not at the bikes, at the skyline, checking the angles, which was what a competent man did when a distraction presented itself, because a competent man knew distractions were tools. Ryder dropped the bike at Duvall and walked toward him with his hands at his sides and his face showing nothing. "Federal operation," he said. "You have agents coming in from the east right now. Stand down, and this ends with nobody in the ground." Duvall looked at him. His weapon came up, not all the way, halfway, a man measuring the geometry of what he was being handed. "Who the hell are you?" Duvall said. "The distraction," Ryder said. From the east side of the property, the sound of 2 tactical vehicles coming across the open ground reached them. The specific engine note of heavy federal vehicles, not trying to be quiet, being fast instead, because fast was the better tool at this stage. Duvall's eyes went to the east, and in that quarter second of redirected attention, Mace came in from Duvall's left and put himself between Duvall's weapon hand and the barn and said very quietly, in the voice Mace used when he was the most serious he was capable of being, "Don't." Duvall's security detail, 6 men visible now, coming from the house and the yard, looked at each other and at the tactical vehicles coming in hard from the east and at the 5 bikers in their yard and ran the arithmetic that every professional runs when the numbers stop adding up in their favor. 2 of them put their weapons down. 4 did not. The first shot came from the south side of the house. Not at Ryder, at Braid, who had moved east toward the barn perimeter and presented himself as the most immediate obstruction to the shooter's sight line toward Sorensen's approaching team. Braid went down behind one of the SUVs with a velocity that looked wrong for a half second before Ryder understood he'd dropped by choice, not impact. The shot had missed by feet, which in the wind at this distance was not surprising, and Braid was flat behind the SUV's front wheel and had a weapon of his own that he was not using yet because Ryder had said they did not shoot first. Ryder crossed the yard at a run toward the man who had fired, covering 40 feet of gravel in a time that surprised even him, and the man had time to track and was tracking when Teller came from a completely different vector, off the porch rail, dropping, landing between the shooter and his next adjustment. and the weapon went sideways, and Teller had both hands on it, and the man went to the ground with Teller's knee in his spine, and the weapon discharged once into the gravel before Teller had it. Federal agents were in the yard now, moving past the bikers toward the house with the economical purposefulness of people who had trained for exactly this specific kind of chaos and found it simply work. Ryder heard Sorensen's voice cutting through the noise. "Federal agents, down, down, hands, get down," coming from the direction of the barn, which meant her team had reached it. Duval had not gone down. Duval had backed to the wall of the main house and was tracking Ryder across the yard with a professional's patience, waiting for the geometry to open up. And Ryder saw him do it and changed his own vector and came at the wall from the south side, putting the corner of the house between them, and heard Duval move to compensate, boots on gravel, and came around the corner fast and low and inside Duval's arm, and the impact of the collision was significant. Duval was 230, solid, and hitting him was like hitting a structure. But Ryder had committed to close distance and was inside the weapon's useful range, and had his forearm across Duval's weapon arm and his other hand at the man's collar, and the two of them went into the wall together with a force that cracked the siding and knocked the air from both of them. Duval was strong and trained and not panicking, which made him dangerous in the specific way that strength and training without panic makes someone dangerous, and he got his elbow into Ryder's ribs twice before Ryder got his foot behind Duval's ankle, and they went to the ground together in the gravel beside the house. And it was ugly, and it was close, and Ryder took a hit above his left eye that opened something up and felt the warm of it start down his face and hit Duval back with everything that 3 years of riding empty roads and absorbing grief had stored in him somewhere, which turned out to be a considerable amount. Duval stopped resisting when Mace put a knee on his back from the opposite side, and even then, he was a man who held tension the way certain structures hold load. Even pinned, the body maintained its argument with the situation. "It's done," Ryder said, breathing hard, blood on his face, gravel in both palms. "It's done." Duval's head dropped to the gravel. From the barn, a sound that Ryder had not expected and was not prepared for. Not a sound of violence, not a gunshot or a shout or the crash of a door. A sound of children. Multiple voices, shocked and uncertain and beginning to understand that the thing that was happening was not another terrible thing, but the opposite of that. And the sound was ragged and high, and it came through the cold afternoon air of northern Montana and landed somewhere in Ryder's chest that had been closed for 3 years and blew it open. He sat in the gravel beside the house with blood on his face and Mace's hand on his shoulder and the sounds of a federal operation completing itself around him. Agents, vehicles, radio calls, Sorensen's voice cutting through all of it. And he listened to the children in the barn, and he breathed. Teller appeared from the side of the house and crouched beside him and looked at the cut above his eye with clinical detachment. "That needs closing." "Later," Ryder said. "Sooner," Teller said, producing a field dressing from somewhere that Ryder had stopped questioning Teller about carrying and pressing it to the cut with a firmness that communicated medical conviction. Ryder held it there. Braid came around the south corner, upright, unhit, his expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man who had remained exactly what the situation required throughout. Behind him, two of Duval's security detail in flex cuffs, federal agents on either arm. Wren appeared at the barn entrance. His face, for the first time since the motel room, had something in it that wasn't operational, something looser and more human. The specific expression of someone who had spent 14 months in proximity to this and was now standing at the door of the room where the reason for all of it became immediate and real and present, in the form of children being brought out into the afternoon light one by one, wrapped in whatever was available. Blankets from the facility, jackets from agents, and counting. 7, 8, a ninth who needed to be carried. Ryder was on his feet without deciding to stand. He walked to the barn entrance and Wren stepped aside, and he looked at the 9 children coming out of that building, and he did the thing he'd been telling himself not to do since the bridge, since the truck cab, since the loading dock at the Rennick Depot, since every moment of the last 18 hours where the math of what this was had been pressing against the door of him demanding entry. He let it in. He stood at the door of a converted barn on a ranch in northern Montana with a field dressing held to his eye and blood drying on his jaw and gravel in both hands. and he watched 9 children come out into the cold and the light. And the particular thing it did to a man who had buried his daughter 3 years ago and been riding away from it ever since was not something that could be put into a caliber or a distance or a velocity. It was simply the full weight of what he'd been carrying and what he'd been protecting and what he'd been protecting it for, arriving at the same moment, and the weight resolved into something that was not grief exactly, not relief exactly, something that didn't have a precise word in any language he knew, but which felt, at its core, like the opposite of empty. Sorensen appeared beside him. She had a radio in one hand and a look on her face that was professional but not sealed. The look of a woman who had been in law enforcement for long enough to have seen the worst of what people did to each other and had somehow kept a place in herself that could still be hit by the best of what people did instead. 9 recovered, she said. Medical is 4 minutes out, all alive. She paused. Ryder. He looked at her. The raid on the Crestline transport hub in Billings is executing right now, she said. DOJ coordinated off Dutch's information while we were in transit. The Helena field office is being swept. Vec is in custody. She stopped. It's collapsing. The whole thing. It's coming apart at every connection point simultaneously. He nodded. He looked back at the children. There's one more thing, Sorensen said. Her voice shifted. Not much, but enough. A degree of careful that hadn't been there before. When we pulled Crestline's internal records, the ones Dutch gave us the access codes for, there was a list, an older one. People they'd moved, assisted, sheltered over the years, people adjacent to the operation who'd been helping from inside institutions. She looked at him directly. There's a name on it you need to know about. The field dressing in his hand. The blood on his face. 9 children in the Montana afternoon. Everything he'd done in the last 18 hours arriving at this exact point, and Sorensen's expression carrying the particular weight of someone who is about to say a name that will... Carla Voss, Sorensen said. The name landed the way names land when you haven't heard them spoken aloud in a long time. Not like a blow, more like a door opening in a wall you'd been pressing your whole weight against, and the sudden absence of resistance almost taking you off your feet. Ryder stood at the barn door with the field dressing at his eye, and the 9 children somewhere behind him in the cold afternoon light, and he said nothing for a moment because there was nothing yet that his mouth knew how to make out of what Sorensen had just said. She's on the list, Sorensen said. Her voice was careful the way a person's voice gets careful when they're delivering something that has weight on both sides of it, weight in the saying and weight in the receiving. Not as a network member. She's flagged in their internal records as a liability, someone they'd been trying to locate for approximately 2 years. Why? Ryder said. His voice came out lower than he intended. Because she'd been helping children get out. Sorensen looked at him directly, and her eyes were doing something that professional eyes rarely do, which was simply being present with what they were saying. From inside, from facilities adjacent to the network's operation. Over the course of at least 3 years, their records show 9 instances of children being transferred to network facilities and arriving without the specific children that Crestline's manifests accounted for. In 8 of those 9 instances, a woman matching Carla Voss's description was the last external contact recorded before the discrepancy. The field grass beyond the property fence moved in the wind. Somewhere to the east, a medical unit was coming. He could hear the engine note of it from far off, growing. She's been in the system, Sorensen said. Not criminal. Witness protection adjacent. She came to a field office in Spokane 14 months ago with partial information. The agent she spoke to reported it upward, and it went somewhere it shouldn't have gone, which means it went to VEC, which means she became a problem to manage, Ryder said. Yes. He thought about Carla. He had not let himself think about Carla in the way that men do not let themselves think about the things that represent the full accounting of what they've cost the people who loved them. She had left 4 years ago, 8 months after Emma. He had not blamed her. He had understood it with the cold, mechanical clarity of a man who could understand things completely while feeling them not at all, which was the only mode he'd had available for a long time. She had packed 2 bags and stood in the doorway of a house that felt like an exhibit of a life rather than a life, and she had looked at him and said, "You're not here, Ryder. You haven't been here in a long time." And he had not argued because she was right, and she had left, and he had gotten on a bike 3 days later and started the long process of going nowhere at speed. "Where is she?" he said. "That's what we're working on right now," Sorensen said. "The Crestline records have a location, a facility in Billings that the DOJ raid is executing on simultaneously. If she's there—" "If," Ryder said. "If," Sorensen said without flinching from it. "I'll know within the hour." He nodded. He looked back at the barn, at the children being walked to a clear area of the yard where 2 federal agents were doing preliminary assessments, writing things on pads, speaking quietly, moving with the practiced gentleness of people who had been trained for this specific kind of aftermath. A girl of maybe 8 was sitting on a folded jacket someone had put on the ground for her, drinking from a water bottle, watching the sky with an expression Ryder recognized. Not blank, not traumatized in any visible external way yet, just the expression of someone who has been in the dark for so long that the presence of light required a period of simple adjustment before anything else was possible. Mace appeared at his elbow. He'd found a clean cloth somewhere and handed it to Ryder, who replaced the field dressing with it and held it to his eye without looking away from the yard. "You need stitches," Mace said. "Later." "That's the second time you've said later in 2 hours." "Then later is twice as true." Mace stood beside him, and they both looked at the yard and said nothing for a while, which was one of the things Ryder had always valued most about Mace. The man's complete comfort with the weight of silence when silence was the correct instrument. "Dutch," Ryder said finally. "In the truck," Mace said. "Hasn't moved. Sorensen's people will take him in." "I know." A pause. "He's going to prison, Ryder." "Yes." "He's 63. "I know how old he is, Mace." Another silence. The wind moved through the field grass and across the gravel yard, and Ryder felt it on the cut above his eye, and the dried blood on his jaw, and the gravel still embedded in both palms. And he thought about Dutch Reyes sitting on a concrete floor in an abandoned rail depot saying 3 years, and he thought about Emma's graveside and the hand on his shoulder. And he thought about the specific kind of grief that comes not from loss, but from the revision of something you believed was real. The retroactive editing of a memory you'd been keeping intact, the way you'd keep a photograph, and understanding that the photograph was accurate, but the story you'd attached to it was not. He thought about it, and then he let it be what it was and moved on, because the alternative was to stand in it, and standing in it was not available to him right now, and possibly not ever. And that was a thing to be reckoned with at some later point. That was not this afternoon in northern Montana, with a cut above his eye and 9 children in the yard, and Carla's name sitting in his chest like something lit. He went to the truck. Dutch was in the passenger seat, door open, feet on the gravel. He looked up when Ryder came around the front of the vehicle, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has done his full accounting and arrived at the number and is sitting with it. Not performing regret, not managing presentation, just sitting with the specific weight of a number that cannot be reduced. "I'm going to ask them to note your cooperation," Ryder said. "I can't promise what it does for you, but I'll say it." Dutch looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "No," Ryder said. "I don't." Dutch looked at the gravel. "Emma would have been—" He stopped. "Don't," Ryder said, quietly. Not as a threat, as a line. The one line he needed Dutch not to cross, because what Emma would have been was not a thing he was prepared to have Dutch Reyes's voice attached to. Not today. Not ever. Dutch nodded. He put his hands on his knees and looked at the yard and said nothing more. Ryder walked back to Sorensen's position at the edge of the property and stood in the cold wind and waited. Teller and Braid had moved the bikes to the side of the access road and were sitting on them or leaning against them, the engines cooling and ticking in the cold, and their presence in that arrangement, 5 bikes, 4 men visible, the particular way bikers occupy space around their machines when the work is done and the waiting has begun, was a thing that had its own grammar, its own meaning, readable to anyone who understood the language. Wren was sitting on the ground near the barn entrance, his back against the wall, his face tilted up at the overcast sky. Not sleeping, just being still in a way that looked like a man who had been in motion for 14 months and was allowing himself 1 minute of not being in motion, storing it against what came next. Sorensen's radio went at 4:12 p.m. She listened. She said 3 words. "Confirmed, stand by." And then she looked at Ryder. "Billings facility," she said. They found her." His hand tightened on the cloth at his eye. She's alive, Sorensen said. She's okay. They had her in a holding situation, she's not hurt. She's okay, Ryder. He turned away from Sorensen and walked to the fence line at the edge of the property and put both hands on the top rail and stood there, looking at the open Montana high country rolling out to the north, the winter-pale grassland and the distant line of the mountains, and the enormous white-gray sky pressing down over all of it. And he breathed. He breathed for a long time. The medical units arrived and the children were assessed, and a woman from a federal victim services team arrived in a separate vehicle and moved through the children with a quiet efficiency that was also, somehow, gentle. The efficiency of someone who understood that their purpose right now was not process, but presence. Ryder watched her work and thought that there were people who did this, who chose to stand in this specific place between the worst thing and the next thing and help people across the distance, and that it was a thing worth noticing and worth respecting. By 6 p.m., the Blackwater property was a fully active federal scene, a constellation of vehicles, agents, medical personnel, and the specific controlled activity of an operation that had broken right and was now in the process of becoming documentation. Cord Duvall and 5 of his detail were in federal custody. 2 had stood down early enough to negotiate a cooperative status. The barn was being processed by a forensics team whose work Ryder did not watch and did not need to. Sorensen found him at 6:20, standing by the Road King with a coffee that Braid had produced from somewhere. A thermos, extracted from a saddlebag with the matter-of-fact practicality of a man who had been on long runs long enough to know that coffee was not a luxury but a logistical component. "You should have that eye looked at before you ride," she said. "I'm going to Billings," he said. She looked at him. "That's 4 hours." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, then, "I'll have her at a federal medical facility on 2nd Street. I'll text you the address." She paused. "Ryder, she asked about you when the agents identified themselves. She asked if you were okay." He looked at the Road King, the blacked-out tank, the worn grips, the odometer that had numbers on it that represented 3 years of roads and distances that had all led, apparently, through a very specific and roundabout route to this. "Tell her I'm coming," he said. She nodded and walked back toward the operational center of the scene, and Ryder finished the coffee and handed the thermos back to Braid and went to find Teller, who closed the cut above his eye with 3 butterfly closures from the field kit and taped it with a competence that suggested this was not the first time Teller had performed this specific service on this specific category of person in this specific category of situation. "You don't have to all come," Ryder said, looking at the 4 of them. Mace looked at him like he'd said something in a foreign language. "Nobody said anything about not coming," Braid said. Teller was already on his bike. Wren stood slightly apart and looked at Ryder, and there was something in the look that was asking a question without asking it. The question of what came after this, what the 14 months meant, what the going and the coming back meant, what the patch on his back meant now in the context of Dutch, and in the context of what he'd chosen to do with himself when the club couldn't contain what he needed to do. "Come," Ryder said. "We'll figure out the rest later." Wren nodded and went to his bike. They rode south in formation as the last light left the Montana sky. 5 Harleys on the long straight highway, headlights up, engines settling into the road hour rhythm that bikers develop over long miles. The rhythm that is part mechanical and part biological and part something harder to name. The rhythm of men in motion who have the same destination and have agreed without speaking that the destination matters. The cold came down fully as the sky went dark, and the highway was nearly empty, and the headlights cut through it, and the engines spoke in the cold air, and Ryder rode at the front and felt the familiar thing the road had been doing for 3 years. The offering of itself as a substitute for everything that couldn't be fixed, the way motion had stood in for purpose, and found, for the first time in 3 years, that the road felt different under him. Not like escape, not like the running kind of forward, like the other kind. They stopped once, south of Havre, at a diner that was open and warm and smelled like coffee and the griddle and the specific institutional warmth of a place that had been feeding people at all hours for many years and intended to continue. They took a booth and a table pushed together. 5 bikers in a diner at 8 p.m., cuts and road dirt, and 1 man with tape above his eye, and all of them carrying something that the hour and the road had not yet fully settled. And the waitress who served them was a woman in her 50s who looked at them and looked at the tape above Ryder's eye and said nothing except, "Coffee for everyone?" And when they said yes, she brought it in heavy mugs and left them to it. They sat in the warmth and drank the coffee and said very little, because very little needed to be said. The things that needed saying would be said across many months and in many different configurations of these men in different rooms, and some of what needed saying would never be said at all, but would be carried and understood and absorbed into the ongoing fact of who they were to each other, which was the way the important things usually went. Mace wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table and said, "The club needs a new inner council." "Yes," Ryder said, "and a founding member's seat that's going to be empty." "Yes, we'll deal with it." "We will," Ryder said. That was all. It was enough. The rest was logistics, and logistics was a thing these men had been solving together for a long time and would solve again. Wren looked at his coffee. "I don't know what my status is," he said. "With the club. After everything." Nobody answered immediately. The diner moved around them. A trucker at the counter, a couple in a far booth, the waitress refilling things, the griddle behind the service window making its patient sounds. Braid looked at Wren. "You left to do something that needed doing," he said. "You came back when you were needed." He picked up his mug. "That's the job." Wren looked at him. "That's always been the job," Braid said, and drank his coffee, and that was the end of that. Ryder looked at his hands around the mug, the butterfly closures on his right palm, the gravel rash on the backs of both hands, the wrapped cut. 3 years of empty roads had done certain things to these hands, and last night had done additional things to them. And they were the hands of a man who had been through a specific sequence of events in a specific order and come out the other side of it changed in ways that would take time to understand and possibly could not be fully understood, but which were, at their core, the kind of change that pointed toward something rather than away from it. He thought about Nyla. Sorensen had confirmed her safe transfer 2 hours ago. A federal facility, medical care, a victim services advocate who would stay with her through the process. She would testify. She would carry what she'd seen and what she'd survived for the rest of her life. And nothing about that was going to be simple or clean or resolved, because the damage those things do does not resolve. It only becomes something you learn to carry differently. But she was alive. She had jumped from a moving van and landed in the mud under a bridge, and held her own pain in her own hands and waited for someone to stop. And someone had stopped, and the 9 children in the barn at the Blackwater property were alive because she had survived long enough to say a name out loud. He would not forget her. He was not sure what the future held for where she went and who she became, but he knew that she had done something in the specific cold dark of one November night that was worth knowing about, and he intended to know about it for the rest of his life. He paid for the coffee. They rode the remaining 3 hours to Billings in the dark. And the dark was the deep and specific dark of the Montana high country at night, stars coming through gaps in the cloud layer intermittently, the highway empty and long and lit only by what they carried with them, and Ryder rode through it and felt the engine through the frame and the cold through his jacket and the road through the tires, and all of it reached him the way things reach a man who is, for the first time in a long time, actually present for the reaching. The federal medical facility on 2nd Street was lit and quiet, and a federal agent met them in the parking lot and said he'd need to hold the brothers outside, which the brothers accepted without comment. And then another agent walked Ryder through a corridor that smelled like antiseptic and industrial coffee, and the low hum of a building that never fully slept. She was in a room at the end of the corridor. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she looked up. Carla Voss was 42 years old, and she was sitting in a chair by the room's window with a blanket over her lap and a cup of something in her hands. And she looked at him standing in the doorway, and something moved across her face that was 4 years of distance and grief and the specific knowledge of what they'd both been through arriving simultaneously at the same point. She looked at the tape above his eye, at the road dirt, at the cut on his hands. "You look terrible," she said. "I've had a long night," he said. She held his gaze, and hers had things in it that would take a long time to say and longer to hear, and a very long time after that to sit inside together. And none of that was available tonight, and they both knew it. And they were both, for the moment, simply present in the same room for the first time in 4 years, which was a beginning. "Sit down, Ryder," she said. He came in and sat in the chair beside her, and outside the window the city of Billings was doing what cities do at 1 in the morning, which is mostly the quiet version of itself, and the light from the window was the gray blue of a winter night, in a place where the cold had settled in to stay for a while. "9 kids," she said. She'd been briefed. He could see it in the way she held herself. "9," he said. "And the ones before them, the ones you helped." She looked at the window. Her jaw moved once and then held. "I didn't know what else to do," she said, "when I found out what was happening. I didn't have your kind of tools. I just had proximity and opportunity, so I used it." "I know," he said. "It wasn't enough." "No," he said, "but it was something, and something mattered." She looked at him. Her eyes were the eyes of someone who had been carrying a weight in solitude for a long time and was in the first moment of understanding that the solitude was over, which is not a simple feeling because long solitude leaves its architecture in you even after the need for it ends. He put his hand on the blanket over her hands. Not over her hands, on the blanket, close. An offer. She turned her hand over and put it under his. Outside in the parking lot, 4 iron revenants were sitting on their bikes in the cold, engines off, not going anywhere, which was the most complete expression of loyalty available to men who express themselves primarily through presence and motion and the willingness to stay. The highway would be there in the morning. The road would be there. For the first time in 3 years, Ryder Voss was not thinking about the road. He was thinking about the room he was in, and the woman in it, and the coffee the nurse had offered to bring when he'd come in. He'd said yes without thinking, and it would arrive, and they would drink it, and outside his brothers would wait in the cold because that was what brothers did. And somewhere across the city, a little girl named Nyla Reed was sleeping in a safe room for the first time in longer than a 10-year-old should ever know. The coffee came. It was hot, and it was real, and it tasted like the end of a very long night, and the night outside the window was already beginning, somewhere far past the city limits, to give way to the first gray suggestion of the morning, thin and cold and true. He drank it. He stayed.